the Bar Association for Commerce, Finance and Industry, the Independent Association, which represents the interest of in-house barristers who work in law firms, work in industry, commerce, finance, and in the government bodies as well. And as a bar association, we've looked at the past at what people call new law, which is new ways of delivering legal services. And tonight, I think we've got a really interesting webinar about how big city law firms are starting to create their own chambers within their firm. So we're very fortunate this evening to have Sahar Faruqi, and apologise if I've mispronounced your name, and we've also got Jonathan Robinshaw from DAC, who are going to talk about how they created a barrister's chambers within their law firm. Sahar specialises in commercial disputes with particular interest in international arbitration. He's presently joint head of 8 DAC Beachcroft buildings, or 8DB, the firm's advocacy service, where he has strategic and operational oversight for the delivery of a traditional chambers type offering to the firm's clients. Prior to joining, he spent over 6 years in the leadership of a purpose-built advocacy business of another international law firm. He specialises in commercial disputes, often with an international focus. Jonathan is the joint head of 8DB and specialises in personal injury, inquests and cost litigation. Having undertaken pupillage in chambers in Manchester, he practiced as a self-employed barrister until joining an international law firm in May 2013 as an employed barrister to create and head up an in-house advocacy team. He successfully built and grew a national team of barristers, advocates and clerks in the first model of its size and scale in England and Wales. So this evening I'll hand it over to our speakers who are going to talk about firming up. So thank you very much. And by the way, this will be recorded. Just please take note.
Thanks for that, Ian. Hopefully everyone will be able to hear us. We're actually, oddly enough, today together in one of the firm's offices in Bristol. So it's been the first time in quite a while we've had an opportunity to get together and meet some colleagues today and some clients as well. As Ian said in that introduction, the two of us together head up 8DB, which is the firm's chambers offering, and it's quite an interesting journey to go through, which is what we're hoping to take you through during the course of this short webinar. But just to understand a little bit about the employed bar and how what we do or what we believe we offer is just about the closest one can get to the idea of self-employed practice and chambers. So what is traditionally the normal barrister way of working, but within the confines, within the safety net, if you like, of employment and a law firm. So how that's slightly different from the normal employed barrister route, if you like, is that a lot of firms, a lot of institutions, a lot of organisations tend to employ barristers on an individual basis, and they will be employed into specific roles. And those roles may or may not require advocacy of them in the traditional way, and they may or may not involve the normal sort of day-to-day for which barristers in chambers are known. But what we have sought to do over the last decade or so is to create a model, as I said, that reflects the idea of having a chambers, but having all of the security of employment. That's obviously attractive to barristers because barristers often go into the profession with a view doing advocacy work, the cut and thrust of what they do, whether that's on paper or orally, will inevitably be advocacy based, and that's what attracts so many people to the profession. So it's an obvious sell for barristers, but why is it attractive to law firms? It's probably most easily explained by what we would refer to as captive revenue. And those two words put together may not literally answer the problem, but they do present an opportunity for law firms. So if you take any of the law firms that we have worked at, or any of the law firms who use the services of chambers and instruct barristers on behalf of their clients, you can imagine that annually they will spend a significant amount of money with barristers' chambers. So let's just say hypothetically, as a law firm, on behalf of your clients, particularly a large law firm, you instruct barristers' chambers up to £100 million a year, every year, across the work that you do. That's what you go to chambers for. It doesn't take a genius, and this is ultimately where innovation lies, because some of the most effective innovation is frequently the most simple. It doesn't take a genius to look at that £100 million figure and say, well, if we employed a few barristers, we could be capturing that captive revenue ourselves. We could retain that as profits for this firm. All we need to do is get some of the barristers who we would otherwise instruct to come and work for us. Now, that is the crux of where this all begins from the perspective of a law firm. As I say, it's not ingenious, it's not particularly complex, it's entirely straightforward, but you can appreciate immediately why that makes sense. So the next thing is if it's so simple, how long has it been going on, where did it start, and why aren't more people doing it? Those are some of the questions that I think we'll hope to address. As I say, for us, it's been about a decade or so in this space. So if I go back to where this was around the time we started, in say sort of 2008 to 2010, there were law firms already toying with this sort of model. You take Herbert Smith, for example. Herbert Smith had an advocacy unit, I think, as early as 2005. And what they were doing in an advocacy unit is very different to what we are doing now in a more sort of holistic chambers model. Herbert Smith had, certainly in 2008, they had two quite heavyweight commercial silks in Murray Rosen and Ian Gatt, and they were supported by a raft of senior associates and associates from within the firm doing advocacy work. So it was an advocacy unit, but it didn't service everything that Chambers did, everything that Herbert Smith did. It didn't service all of their work. It sought to service a discrete area of what they did, and that worked for them. If you step away from Herbert Smith and you look at Lyons Davidson, who were a more sort of regional firm, particularly actually with offices here in Bristol as well, Lyons Davidson were a firm that as early as sort of 2010 did have an advocacy team and an advocacy model, which they were looking to offer their clients, and that model involved something which we'll come on to shortly, which is a combination of advocates and also qualified barristers. In relation to how that progressed, I think that's probably a neat point as we kind of move into 2012, 2013 to bring in Jonathan and talk a bit about how we looked at the advocacy team model and how that could be developed into some of the hallmarks of what we see today.
So the start of our journey really starts around 2013 when I joined our previous firm with an idea or a view or a vision of building an advocacy unit out of 3 advocates that we had there in that space at that time. And because it was such a small unit with a big vision, I mean, quite a large international firm, the beginnings are very entrepreneurial. It wasn't something that the board had set about as a vision for the firm to have this chambers arm. It was something that a few of us within the business decided was something that we wanted to do and would be a real value add to our clients. But it's something that came from the inside out. It was something that we had to develop ourselves. So you had to have those skills and abilities of a barrister that you could attribute to traditional counsel in going out there, doing the business development, walking the boards, learning what it was that our business did and how we could fit into that. And so at the beginning, it was a real test of our conviction of, was this something that could survive within a law firm? Was this something that we could really sell to the fee earners, first of all? Was it something we could sell to the clients? Because let's face it, over 500 years of doing something in one way leads people to continue to do it in that way. And so trying to teach people that you could do it another way, as some of you may have experienced before, is quite a difficult task, quite a daunting task, especially when you're, in essence, competition from the external bar is extremely good at what they do and has already been in place for a number of years, doing exactly what it is that they're set out to do. And that's what you're challenging. You're challenging those behaviors of the fee earners. You're challenging that model that we all bought into and trained up at law school thinking we were going to go into. One of the things that we had to do within the business to differentiate, to give a unique selling point for clients, was to develop this two-tier advocacy model, which Sahar alluded to, which was having counsel who could do trials, could do hearings that required rights of audience, but then uniquely identifying within the Legal Services Act an ability to employ non-qualified barristers, advocates who had done the vocational training but hadn't done pupillage yet, hadn't qualified as a barrister, utilising the Legal Services Act to give them rights of audience at a limited level. Of course, they couldn't do fast-track trials or multi-track trials. Anything that was defined as in chambers, they could do. And with that, we developed what a business then really cottoned on to as a unique way of increasing the GM percentage of this business. And then it was identified as something with potential to grow profitability. And of course, working within the business, you quickly learn that is what is going to attract attention from the board. That is what's going to give you the ability to grow and develop in the way that you want to. So that was the necessity for the business model, really, that we developed it in that way. But what we got from that was a real unique sense of growing and developing those within the profession that we may not have got if we were at the self-employed bar. At an early stage, when we grew, and Sahar came very quickly after that point into the business, we grew to a state that it could no longer function without the appropriate operational functions of a chambers. At the very beginning of it, we were saying things like, we're different from chambers, we work in a different way to chambers, in a very naive way of trying to separate ourselves from that, to distinguish ourselves against the competition. But very quickly then you realize there is a reason why they operate in the way that they do. And then suddenly you start finding yourself in a position where you think, actually, we need clerks. We can't manage our own diaries. We need people to do diary allocation. We need people to be a link between the clients and us. And then we quickly found ourselves in a position where we were recruiting a clerking team and recognizing within a business who was going the other way in terms of resourcing support. In all law firms and in all most businesses, even pre-COVID, people were looking for a way of centralizing support. And we were then saying, actually, we need dedicated support because it's a different role and it's a different thing that we asked them to do. And that was one of the elements, including software, that led us to develop much more into what we would recognize as a chambers style model of working operationally. In that early stage, we were looking at were the firm had a volume of instructions, because we were only focused in growing instruction levels and growing utility to the business. So we were doing pretty much the practice areas that were core to the law firm, and we weren't looking beyond that at all. We were developing our advocates and we were developing our counsel in that core practice area state. And then when we look a few years on between 2016 and 2020, that's the phase where we are maturing the model. We've proved that the concept works. We've proved that a law firm can have an in-house advocacy team that operates in a way that a chambers may also operate, with a clerking team, with this unique idea of a two-tier advocacy system of non-qualified and qualified advocates. And we're looking to develop that and mature it into a real viable business. And we did that by establishing it as a limited company in its own right. So we were still within the umbrella company organisation, but we were now a separate company to the law firm itself. And this solved a multitude of things that had become issues for us. One of them had become billing issues, but being a separate entity meant that the billing issues with our own law firm went away. So we didn't have whip write down or write off that some solicitors or fee earners would suffer from. We'd separated ourselves from that. We also attempted to solve an issue some clients had identified, which was objectivity. Of course, one of the main advantages of the external bar is that a client can feel they're getting a real second view, a real second opinion on what the panel law firms are saying to them about an issue or problem, or even a policy decision that the client wants to make. That's setting ourselves up as that distinct separate entity in that structured chambers model gives the client a better indication that we are and we do function in a way that counsel does, and we can provide that second opinion, even if we are so closely tied to the firm of the solicitors. We still work in the same way that counsel does, whether or not we are based in an external chambers or in in-house chambers, and it operates in the same way. Of course, what it also opened up was an ability to work for external clients. So this was a real key part of our development. This was working for other regional law firms, giving us quite niche work that they were utilising chambers for. And this allowed us to both extend our revenue streams, but also to expand the practice areas that we were covering, move away from those core areas that our law firm were delivering to clients, and move into perhaps some development, enabling us to develop sub-teams.
Just to interject there for a second, that is, to my mind, when I look back on the journey we've been through, the moment we started taking on work from solicitors outside the firm, excuse me, the moment we started taking on work from solicitors outside our own mothership, outside our own firm, was definitely for me one of the moments where the external bar started really taking notice of our model, because that was, okay, fair enough, you're doing your own thing in that firm, and that's not ideal from our perspective, because we've had a monopoly on that, but you're confined. And when we had jumped over a particular set of regulatory hurdles to start pushing ourselves out into the wider market, that was definitely a moment where I started getting messages and calls from people saying, how far are you going to take this? Which was quite interesting.
Yeah, and it was a real motivational driver. It was a key point where me and Sahar running the business, but also those within the business, really started to get the sense of where the potential was for this enterprise. And it's then that we started to develop key sub-teams within the unit, recognised teams that did regulatory inquest work, people who did cost litigation only as a specialism, those that would do employment work, those that would do commercial work, and starting to establish key heads of those units as well, real credible heads that could lead sub-teams in that way. And it needed that external source of work in order to get that variety and to get that exposure into those type of works to develop our people. And one of those areas that we sought to expand to, Sahar was instrumental in was seeking international work.
So yeah, the international side of things kind of develops because you're housed within an international law firm for a start, who have connections and offices across the globe, and you are looking to forge and develop a practice. And as Jonathan has said, you're spiraling out year on year. You're either recruiting talent, or as an individual, you're developing your own practices. And it's a point I'll come on to in a moment, but I mentioned captive revenue. You also have a captive audience in the solicitors who work within the firm. Pre-COVID, you're physically sat together. So rather than pick up the phone to Chambers, they will lean back in their chair and say, can I just pick your brains on this? And once they've had that conversation, they feel like, oh, actually, you do have an idea of this already. It would probably make more sense to instruct you on this, or for you to be involved in this, as opposed to the junior that Chambers is lining up with their silk. That is invaluable as a business development opportunity, but it also just propels the way in which individuals and their practices are developing. So for me, I had wanted to develop a practice in international arbitration work, and because I got to know that particular team, because I got to know some of the senior partners in that team, I was very, very quickly given an opportunity which in Chambers it simply wouldn't have been possible for me to do, because if it came in as a query or an instruction, there would have been 15 people ahead of me who would have had first refusal. So it meant that I was faced with opportunities that were really going to stretch me and push and propel my practice, which is fundamentally one of the single biggest advantages of being a barrister within a law firm. The escalation to your practice is exponential. It is so much quicker than Chambers, because there's no other way to put it. It comes back to that captive audience, and because they are, to some extent at least, incentivized to use you by your accessibility, by your physical or virtual presence on the same systems, you're more linked up and linked in to how they work and the cultural values of the firm and the cultural values of the clients that they work with. It becomes an easier and easier sell for them. So they're less inclined to go through the process of talking to Chambers, and they just find it easier to work with you. Around this time as well, in that time period Jonathan's identified, 2016 to 2020, was also when, once we became a limited company, we embraced what I would refer to as a kind of a dual regulation. As a limited company, we were regulated by the SRA, but as individuals, we were regulated by the BSB. So that tells you, just in a nutshell, to be dual regulated tells you how squeaky clean we have to be. So if people ever raise questions or doubts about, well, how does that model work? Has it been run past the SRA? Has it been run by the BSB? We can both tell you from incredibly, almost painfully extensive experience, it has been run by both of them, and it continues to be run by both of them. But it works because you get the best of both worlds, and you end up with a model that makes a lot of sense. Where do the problems lie, though? You have a massive problem, and it was a problem that we saw in the first few years, and it took us a while to convince the board of the firm that we were working at the time. We have a problem with retention, because we bring in these advocates, we give them work that pushes them right up to the limit of where their rights of audience are allowed by the Legal Services Act, and then we put them into tribunal work in an employment context where you will know that no rights of audience are required, or they get involved in international arbitration work, generally ADR work, where there is no rights of audience. They are constantly against counsel from really, really good sets of chambers, and they are ready for pupillage, and they are leaving us for pupillage. And when they go to interview, they are head and shoulders above some of the other applicants because of the experience they've got. And they're always going to leave us because that's ultimately what they're looking for. which is why in 2017 we went through the process with the BSB of becoming a approved training organisation for pupillage, and the two of us initially trained as pupil supervisors, and subsequently a number of other colleagues trained as pupil supervisors, and then we started to take on pupils, and that in and of itself almost overnight dealt with a lot of retention issues, at least with talent that came in as pupils. So that's also an incredibly important part of the journey. But just again to talk about some of the opportunities that exist in a model like this, I've mentioned already that that practice acceleration. I won't harp on too much about the general benefits of employment because those are trite and they are well known to anyone who understands the difference between self-employment and employment. But to my mind, a couple of other things really stand out as opportunities you get from being an employed barrister in a law firm within the model that we've identified. And I'll refer to those as management and business development. So management is something that at the self-employed bar you just won't do, not in an employment context anyway, because you're all self-employed, so you're never going to actually be somebody's manager. Of course, chambers have various structures and seniority in various teams and sub-teams and subcommittees. That's absolutely true and will always continue to be true, but it's not management per se. It isn't the same thing as bringing in somebody and having responsibility for the development of their career and being trained in how to do that and how to propel their career and how to watch them succeed and afford them the various forms of training that a large firm pushes people through. If you're someone who enjoys that as an idea, if you're someone who wants that as at least a collateral aspect of your working life, then it's something which employment will afford you. Similarly, BD or business development is also something which, of course, self-employed barristers absolutely have to do. Frequently, you will find they are heavily reliant upon their clerks, and of course, our clerks and our practice managers do a fantastic job in that regard for us as well. But in the context of employment, it takes on another facet altogether. So I have had the opportunity to do business development on behalf of not just our advocacy function, but the entire firm. And that has seen me visit 13 countries around the world, because one of the things you find yourself doing is being an ambassador, not just for the brand that you represent within the firm, but for the firm as a whole. And you are constantly cross-referring things into, say, for example, the corporate team or the real estate team. And you may think to yourself, well, actually, that's not really hugely useful because the corporate team don't do contentious work. So they're not going to be referring us work in the medium term, even long term. But actually that's completely wrong, because it's the corporate partners who hold the commercial relationships. They are the ones who deal with these clients day in, day out. They are the ones who set up the structures for them, who help negotiate the contracts that ultimately may result in a legal dispute. And when that client has a dispute, they don't call a dispute resolution lawyer, they don't call a barrister, they call the lawyer who they know, who's been involved in that transaction from the get-go, and they say to them, do you know anyone who can help us with this? And again, being in their mind, having referred work to them, it all lends itself to that business development aspect. So those, I think, are some of the opportunities that exist within a model like this, which I have found to be particularly rewarding, to be particularly interesting, which exist alongside a job which directly, not just resembles, but is directly the same as that of a barrister in chambers. Because of that escalation, I can say quite genuinely and without equivocation, to have a practice that exceeds my call significantly, which is really important for me. So bearing all of those things in mind, the question then becomes, if this model is so great, why isn't everyone doing it? And what are the barriers to entry?
Yeah, obviously from our perspective, we don't understand why more firms don't do it. From, I suppose, the bunker mindset that we were potentially in at our old firm, we had some discussions with other law firms over the years, understanding they were seeking to understand the model and what we were doing. And I suppose there was a lot of cynicism and a lot of suspicion that it simply was never going to be as good as Chambers in terms of service delivery or quality of outcomes, or simply that if they proposed it to clients, it was going to simply rock the boat. Clients wanted to go to Chambers, they understood that model, and a lot of law firms don't want to upset that or simply aren't even thinking about it. The interesting thing for Sahara and I is over a year ago, when we were starting to consider whether or not we had reached the capacity for growth and development and innovation in our previous law firm, seeking to house this in-house Chambers in a new space, we had various conversations amongst the top 50 law firms in the UK and opened up a debate and conversation with them about had they considered it, was it something they were open to, did they want to discuss further how we could make it work in their space. And the amount of times we were surprised by the response, which was, we have tried it, but it didn't work for us. And it was then interesting to talk to them and develop with them the reason why it hadn't worked. And a number of the reoccurring themes were simply they had one or two experts in a particular niche field who did all their advocacy, did all their trial work, but then once that individual left or moved on, it died away with it. So they weren't getting to a critical mass sufficiently so that the team could survive the individuals, either because of numbers or because of credibility or reputation that was being too condensed into one or two individuals. That was interesting to see it. Another was simply that they saw it as a way of delivering on volume work only. So some law firms would have quite a big team. We know Lyons Davidson had a team of over 40 individuals who were doing advocacy work, but it was just in the high volume, low value work. They saw it as a way of saving in that area. So what you are is very vulnerable to a regulatory change, an industry change, or a policy change in that space that then suddenly makes that work totally non-profitable. And that's what happened to the Lyons Davidson team, unfortunately. There was a change in funding for the civil litigation, and that team overnight became unprofitable.
And I think some of the cynicism you're talking about also came from the fact that there's a solicitor mindset to how revenue should be, pound for pound, right?
Yeah.
So in the traditional, very traditional solicitor model setup, there is a view that if you hire somebody on, let's just use completely notional figures, if you hire somebody on £10,000 a year, which actually I think would be illegal, so it's a good notional figure. If you hired somebody on £10,000 a year to be a solicitor in your firm, then you expect them to return revenue of 4 times that. So you expect them to deliver £40,000 a year. Barristers don't work in the same way. So if you are a solicitor's firm and you apply that model and you say, right, well, barristers have to immediately deliver that same ×4 model, it won't work. So as a law firm, you have to look at it and say, okay, so the variables and the margins involved here are different. It's still profitable and it still pushes us into new revenue, but it's a different way. Now, for some firms, that's an easier sell than it is for others, because some firms will simply look at it and say, all right, if it's not ×4, we're not, that's just not us. Whereas other firms will say, okay, it's not ×4, what is it? Okay, does that work for us? How do we make that work?
And it also requires that firm to have that vision and desire to innovate with the traditional legal model, and understand that actually what we're offering to our clients is what they've been asking for years, is to do something different. The pitches and tenders that law firm partners go to, and they say, well, we're good at delivering service delivery, we're good lawyers, we know what we're doing. And the clients are saying constantly, well, what are you doing differently? How do you deliver legal services in a different way than the other three law firms that are coming to this tender discussion today? And if you don't have an answer to that as a law firm in today's modern world, then you're struggling. If you don't have the vision as a law firm to say, well, actually, one of the ways that we can do that is to offer advisory service and advocacy service in-house in a streamlined way. Let's have the barristers and the fee earners working together in the same offices, in the same systems, utilizing the same policies that run from the client all the way through fee earner to counsel to trial. And if you can't adapt from that financial way of thinking that Sahar's been talking about and understand that it fits in a different way, then you may not even get past the business case stage. And that's what we were finding when we were having those conversations. There was always a reason why law firms in the top 50 that we were speaking to had never established more than a critical mass of individuals that were carrying out this work. Why we only spoke to the top 50 is quite an easy one to respond to. You need that sufficient work, that core practice to sustain a model that has numbers of that critical mass. It has to be a huge revenue player in the top 50, so that it has sufficient work in contentious litigation to justify the model. What it also has, which is very important, part of the conversations that we were having with these law firms, is a culture. It has to have a unique culture of cross-selling. All of the partners and client relationship partners specifically have to have a culture of transparency. They have to be open to engaging with the business in those discussions with their clients. If they think that having a conversation with a client about a new innovative product from a different side of the business is dangerous and risky, then that's not the culture that this sort of model will survive in. We need to survive in a culture of transparency and openness, a culture where all the CRPs and partners are pulling the same way. Bringing in other people from the business is actually exciting, and they are excited to do that. And that's what we were lucky enough to find in the firm that we joined, the DACB. We were surprised at the beginning of that process. Sorry, we would have been surprised at the beginning of the process if we had told each other that at the end of it, we would only find one or two firms where it would work, they had the vision for it, they have the culture for it, and we would want to be a part of that. I think going into it, we thought there would be a huge list for us to choose on the top 50 of ones that we wanted to establish it in, but actually only a very few of those had all those requirements that we've just discussed.
So then I think that the question after that becomes, where can it go as a model, or what is the upper end? And you have to acknowledge, as we have done, that there are certain truths and certain limitations on the model, certainly at least as it currently is. For example, we don't currently have any silks. That's not to say that we won't, and it's not to say that the firm doesn't frequently instruct silks, because we know from the information that we see, the management information that we see, that it clearly does. There will come a time where that becomes appropriate, but everything is, in that context, led by the revenue. It's led by how much spent, where it's spent, and then finding the talent, because the employed bar, as we know, is not necessarily for everyone. But one of the things that barristers who join us end up saying after a little bit of time exposed to the model, or even in interview, is, oh, so it's just like a chambers. Yes, it is. The difference is that our guys are employed, and that is the real difference. It's gone from a conversation, and I've had this conversation with Ian before as well, about how the employed bar continues to be treated with, I think it's fair to say, a degree of cynicism, in certain quarters with a degree of derision, because I have certainly heard it said during the course of my career, the employed bar is where barristers go to die. But there is a growing inclination, and there will be, especially post-COVID, when people want the security, when they've been through what they have in the last 18 months or so, to look at models like this and recognise that it represents an opportunity for something different. It represents an opportunity for a degree of financial security without compromising on the quality of work. In fact, if anything, it may simply, as I've said, escalate that. But it will also give you a really exciting chance to just push forward. And one of the biggest questions we get asked by self-employed barristers who have joined us, and at date I think we're about 15 barristers, combining the advocates and the clerks for about 25 in number. One of the questions that self-employed barristers will always ask is, to what extent will it interfere with my independence? Not the independence that Jonathan's spoken about around, are you still able to criticise your clients? Are you still able to give tough advice? Of course you have to, because that's just part of the job, and nothing can possibly erode that. But more from the perspective of someone who's had the ability to decide over the last couple of years of their practice, right, I worked until 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday to prepare for my trial this week, and when that trial goes short and it finishes at 3 o'clock on Tuesday, I'm not going to go in on Wednesday. I'm not going to work that day because I've done everything that I was supposed to do. That's why we tell people that this isn't a 9-to-5 job. So you can't look at it and say, right, it is going to be 9 to 5, because that's not how barristers work, not in this type of practice. So it really, really does recreate everything that happens in terms of practice in chambers. And we genuinely believe that as this process continues, of course it will need tweaks. We're continuing to learn at every single point. But we do believe that more and more firms, especially based on some of the conversations we've had, will begin toying with their own versions of this model, which we are now doing for the second time at an international law firm. And we do genuinely believe that it will represent an alternative to chambers in a number of different firms. There will always be a place for chambers. There will always be a place for the external bar, or however you want to refer to it. But this model has legs, and that's why, as we wrote in Counsel magazine, we think there is serious scope for what we've termed firming up the bar. So I think that's it from us. Hopefully that's been interesting. And Ian, I think over to you.
Yeah, well, I think I'm sure you'll welcome some questions from the audience. Whilst we're waiting for those questions to come in, and you can do that by raising the hand symbol or raising it in a chat box. But how do you set the salaries for your fee earners as compared to a solicitor's firm then? You don't have to give away how much you pay, but just interesting how you calculate or set the salaries for the fee earners.
No comment.
So, yeah, there's clearly got to be a need for it to be a viable business model, and that involves, you know, all the usual boring things that means are very excited to do come every February of budgeting. So there has to be a business model that allows for certain salaries at the non-qualified end and at the qualified end. But like with everything, if there is an opportunity, if there's a revenue stream that we can't access because of lack of skill set or ability, then it can sometimes justify higher salaries bringing in that would otherwise make sense to unlock a potential, so that then people can be brought in behind them, because what we can do that Chambers can't do is get that figurehead to open up and unlock that work, and then populate that sub-team with non-qualified people to balance out the GM of that team, or more junior members, as Sahar was saying, who will be carrying out work that they wouldn't get the opportunity to at Chambers, that's beyond their call in that accelerated manner. So there is an element of balancing that we have to do, but we have shown consistently throughout the years that the salaries that we're offering are clearly sufficient to attract the talent from the external bar that we have already.
I think that's a really important point, because from our end of the table during an interview like that, we can see exactly how much the firm is spending on counsel at that person's call. So we will be able to tell you during the course of the interview, which of course we won't, but we'll be able to tell you how much they would be able to bill. There's a degree of hearts and minds involved in that, because they have to win the trust of those people. And there's a more bland answer to your question, which involves an analysis of that particular barrister's earnings in Chambers, by which I mean their net earnings, and then you have to apply a formula which we have perfected after a number of years, which also attributes the benefits that they will get from employment to come out at a figure which then really is the basis on which you have the negotiation if it gets to that point.
Great, thank you. I think we have a question from Michaela Hardwick. Do you want to?
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Ian. I've actually got two questions, if I may. The first is really looking at the benefits. I'm actually a solicitor working with both solicitors and barristers. And first of all, I have to say that excellent model, and your speech is almost could have been planned and scripted, is exactly how I think it should have been done. So applause. One question or one issue that I always query in relation to the self-employed bar is business succession. You've got individual barristers who spend an awful lot of time generating their business over a long period of time, and then come to the end and they don't actually have a saleable asset. It's all based on their name. And as I see it, your model would create potential for business succession and for individuals to capitalise on that. Would you think that that's fair to say?
Yeah, well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the last firm we were at, where we spent a considerable part of this speech talking about what we did there. As soon as we left, they brought in another very experienced barrister to lead the business and recruited a number of other people, and that business continues to go from strength to strength, which tells you that the model is entirely succession capable or succession proof, or whatever the term would be.
Yeah, and I think thanks for your comment about the model, but in reality, that's purely because Sahar and I built the model that we wanted it to be. It was selfish intent, really, that we wanted something bigger than ourselves. One of the reasons I did what we did was because I enjoyed the work of being a self-employed barrister, but I wanted it to be more meaningful, more than just myself building something bigger than just my own practice, just because of the desire that I have and the interests that I have. So it really was about building something for us to be happy in, rather than wanting to build something.
Yeah, and I will say as well that I think Jonathan alluded to it earlier, that where other firms have fallen down in trying to set this up is that they've lacked a critical mass. So they've had 2 or 3 barristers and 1 or 2 people go, and their whole system falls apart. Again, and I can say this because it's history now, but it's also documented on public record in legal articles at the time as well. This is how sustainable the model we created was. When we left our previous firm, subsequently 15 other people decided to follow us, and they're still going and they're doing very well. So that really does tell you that, as I say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
It's because you're talking about succession planning. One of the benefits that we don't really think about that often, although it's really evident in our day-to-day role, is we're supported by a framework of an international law firm. And that's massive in reality. We're talking to guys who are thinking about our business for us. You know, that our head of HR, our business partner for HR, asked for a meeting for us last month to talk about succession planning. Yeah. To lead into your question, you know, we've been here for 5 months, and now they want to talk about succession planning. Not that they're not happy with the work that we're doing, the way that it's going. But exactly what you're talking about, this is a business. This is a model that has to live beyond me and Sahar. It has to be able to survive us, because they build it in a way to their clients, which is it's now an integral part of the business that DACB offers, and that has to live beyond me, Sahar, or any of our other senior counsels. So yes, I think you're right. It has to live beyond individuals.
But that was only one question.
Yeah, and I think just building on that, as well as business succession, I imagine that from a self-employed barrister's point of view, it would be the opportunity to capitalise at that point of succession, which currently really does not exist as I see it. So I guess that's where I was coming from. Yeah,
thank you. That's really good. We've got a couple more questions. Tricia, who used to head the serious fraud office, says clients prefer to tell their tale only once. In the SFO, we had a model for incorporating counsel, inviting them into the first conference, then afterwards more often as court proceedings got nearer. It worked pretty well. The hourly rate went into the case costs, as did our in-house hourly employed rate. Any comments on that?
Sorry, it might be helpful to hear from Tricia directly. I can see her on the screen. Yeah. I wasn't able to follow the question. Sorry.
Sorry, I wasn't the head of the serious fraud office, Ian. I was a deputy. But I was certainly there for a long time, and we tried to incorporate counsel quite a lot. Of course, we were watching the solicitors' firms were doing it too, if you remember, in the 80s. There were captive solicitors' firms, which actually employed some barristers at the time, who worked for all the big PwC and Arthur Andersen and all the rest of them of happy memory, ho-ho. I mean, sadly, they didn't manage to make it work completely, probably because you don't go to an accountant to get litigation, whereas you do go to firm solicitors. So your clients are already anxious to get litigation out of you, or the settlement of it. And I certainly think that you need to, I mean, I wish you all the success. I mean that from the bottom of my heart, because I think it's terribly important to give clients a choice. And as I say, they prefer to sell their stories only once. And if you're a one-stop shop for them, that's brilliant. And the best way I can suggest that you aim to succeed is by winning some cases. Get in there and win some high-profile cases against the self-employed bar, and we call them the self-employed bar. We are the employed bar. You are something halfway in between, quite frankly, which is a good thing. And one day, perhaps, the Bar Standards Board will be interested in regulating you. But despite our efforts, you go to solicitors, and they're as good as anyone, and actually probably better. So I do wish you the best of luck, and I wish you some nice, high-profile successes. Wipe the floor. Don't think you need silks. Actually, motivated juniors, and as you say, well-supported juniors, will win just as often.
Or become silks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. And we've got another comment online from Nazima. Does Nazima want to ask us? There's a comment there. Thank you. It's very informative. In setting up the business with this model, how does it work where a counsel is employed and is a tenant at Chambers and shall be joining the firm, not leaving his or her practice? What challenges can the firm face in these circumstances? Will there be any difficulty with BSB approving it?
Yeah, so it's actually something that I did. 2013, I was a tenant in Manchester, And openly and honestly, I kept my door tenancy at Chambers to have a side door. I'd, as most constitutions of Chambers mandate, there was a buy-in to my set post-pupillage. So I had already invested in that model, which I had always thought was where I wanted to end up to be. So I didn't question that at that stage. So I invested in that way professionally and obviously financially. And then when DWF said, do you want to come and work in this team and head it up going forward, it was 3 people, and I was the only qualified member. So I think it was only prudent of me to think, good to keep that side door open. So I was door tenant at Chambers and an employee of the firm. And I just had to have a dual practicing certificate from BSB. It wasn't difficult at all. The only thing I had to set up was an agreement between Chambers and the firm in terms of conflict of interest. And obviously, because I was employed by the firm, it was always resolved in their favour. So any conflict I had was resolved in the firm's favour. So no, it wasn't difficult. It was very straightforward, and the BSB were very accommodating with it. It's gone the other way now, full circle, as things tend to do. One of our employed barristers at DACB asked us a couple of months ago if they could apply for a door tenancy at Chambers. So full circle, someone employed is now looking to work alongside Chambers. And that's solely because of a revenue stream or type of work that they did in our previous firm, that they now want to continue offering those solicitors who understandably aren't going to instruct the DACB, a competitor firm, to utilise him. So he's using Chambers to service work from our old firm.
Thank you very much. It's Nazima speaking. I just wanted to know, you mentioned that it is door tenancy, but we are currently looking into this model as well, and we're planning to work with certain chambers, and the chambers are ready to supervise our pupils in the future, but they're going to be not door tenant, but they will be full-time tenant at Chambers. Well, will that be a problem? Or you don't see it as an issue? I do understand with the conflicting part, we have considered that, and we made certain requests to the BSB already.
Yeah, no, I think there's no difference with tenants and door tenants. I simply wanted door tenancy because I wasn't going to have the receipts to pay the full fees, so I didn't want to be a full tenant at Chambers. That was my choice. I chose door tenancy so that I didn't have to pay Chambers expenses. Same thing with our employed barrister now. But if I was a default tenant and an employed barrister, there wouldn't be any issue. I'd just have to have a dual practicing certificate and set up my conflict.
I have to say, I think over the years, almost without exception, and I can't think of an exception, anyone who's either started with us, either holding a tenancy or a door tenancy, has ultimately let it go. Not because we have any issue with it, but simply because they're paying for it. And eventually they think, why am I paying for this? Because there's nothing in it. A few of them have said, I've continued to keep it so that I have a foot in the door and I'm able to bluntly still have some clout with the clerks who are chasing my age debt. But once the bulk of that satisfies, they've then pulled out. Because the other thing is, not to put too fine a point on it, but employed barrister, self-employed barrister, you have a practicing certificate. So if you decide to leave us and you want to go into a set of chambers, most sets, of course, they'll have a tenancy committee, but as a practicing barrister with an established practice, it's not likely to be something that really worries you, unless you are at a particular leading set with a niche and you really worry about whether you'd be able to get back in. So overall, I think it's something that's quite flexible, and as long as you're in pretty consistent and careful dialogue with the BSB, I think you'll be fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, the thing that crossed my mind is when I was doing pupillage, there was a lot of talk about barristers' chambers setting themselves up as partnerships, and in those days it was very much a no-no, because we can't have that because there may be conflicts of interest between members of chambers and things like that. But I wonder now whether it's possible for a barristers' chambers to change its model to become a limited company and employ some of its barristers.
Yeah, well, you're probably looking 5 years into the future.
Mm-hmm.
It'd have to be an ABS structure, right, which is
Yes.
permitted by the Legal Services Act and could be regulated by the BSB. A law firm could be regulated by the BSB if they wanted to. I know a few examples are, because it's easier and cheaper.
Yes.
But yeah, you may be looking to the future. I knew a set in Manchester, I won't name them, but they looked into the ABS structure when it first was developed, so that they could, in essence, they could employ solicitors who sit within chambers to accept instructions and be a stream of work. So they are the gatekeepers of the work, and then it goes into chambers to service.
It's the opposite to your model, really, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's the reverse.
Exactly. It's coming to the same point from different direction.
Yeah.
And who's to say that won't happen in 10, 15 years' time?
There is something, although I won't profess to be overly familiar with their model, but I've been against them in the past. There is a firm called Joseph Haig Aronson. Joseph Haig Aronson is a commercial law firm that is comprised of barristers and solicitors, including several leading counsel. So the way their model works, they have solicitors feeding into barristers. As I say, I'm not completely familiar with whether that's how that's structured, but I'm aware that at least one firm is certainly pushing at that.
There's some interesting comments as well from Andal, and Trisha's also made another comment as well. If you can see on the screen, Andal says, how does the firm handle commercial conflicts with work that might do or for other solicitors' firms? Like many clients, we take a slightly wide view of what constitutes a commercial conflict.
Yeah, so I mean, law firms have very, very intricate and careful structures for approaching commercial conflicts, and DACB is no exception. So even since arriving here in the last 6 or 7 months, I have onboarded three different solicitors firms who are external to this one, and in every single case they have been heavily vetted and scrutinized, and where there is the prospect of commercial conflicts with a big client, that's ultimately something that has to be resolved really at board level when it presents that type of risk. Because fundamentally, let's be honest, this is one of the reasons why people leave larger law firms to create boutiques, because you have partners who are just sick of being conflicted all the time, and they recognize I could create a really quite interesting practice just on the basis of everything we keep turning down from conflict. So the approach is done very, very carefully, and if there is any kind of ambiguity, then it will always be resolved in favor of what represents the biggest revenue opportunity to the firm. Yeah.
And then Nazima, in terms of getting pupils, BSB has certain policies in hiring, offering pupilages. Will the same apply for this model when offering pupilages, or it can be done in a normal way the company would have done as before, becoming a pupillage AETO?
I think the answer to that is, from bitter experience, you have to do absolutely everything by the book. Pupillage is something which is so heavily and carefully regulated, and the process now, which we're currently going through here at DACB to register as a pupillage provider, every single year it changes and it becomes more complex, which is bizarre, frankly, given the state of pupillage. It's something that I have great personal difficulty in understanding. But having said that, it is what it is, and until they change it, you have no choice but to jump through every single one of the hoops. And to answer the thrust of the question, it absolutely cannot be the standard recruitment process of a law firm. It has to be advertised at the right time, in the right way. It has to be advertised internally, externally. It has to comply with absolutely every aspect of it. Otherwise, not only do you risk reputational damage to your firm from a process that doesn't work, you're also fundamentally potentially asking people to apply to you, not being able to give them the opportunity that they applied for. So the answer is you must comply with absolutely every requirement.
But
we'd be interested with your feedback on pupilages, because we are lobbying the BSB and Bar Council to try and make pupilages easier for all employed barristers to be able to offer wherever they're working, and there are barriers in the way. So perhaps separately you can let us know, because we are in dialogue with the Bar Council and the Employed Bar Committee and the BSB to try, because what we'd like to do is be able to create more opportunities for pupilages where there is a real shortage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, it's now 7:10, so I'm afraid I think we're going to have to draw it to a close, but it's been really interesting hearing your model of business, and you know, I think there's lots more different alternative models for providing legal services, and I think this one is a very interesting one and very relevant to the work that BACFI is doing. So thank you very much, both of you, for giving this presentation, and I hope all of you have enjoyed it as well. Do remember that if you're not a member of BACFI, it's only about £70 a year, and we also offer corporate membership as well. So do speak to Sandra about joining. We're having a little break in the summer in August, but we'll be resuming with more events in September. We're hoping to offer a webinar on white collar crime, and we've also got a student event, as well as our famous Denning lecture, where we've got the General Counsel for the Serious Fraud Office giving the lecture this year. So we've got quite an exciting programme of events, and so thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all have a lovely summer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Sandra.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.